Okay, in this lesson, we're going to be covering frequency tables or frequency distributions. Here's just an example of a data set that I'm going to ask you to make a frequency distribution for. So this example is saying that they took a sample of 20 homes and they were asked how many cars were registered to their household. And the results are here from below. So we talked about this in the last lesson. We are going to make a frequency distribution, which is going to show the number of cars as our data points. You could make tallies if it makes it easier to organize the data, but then we need frequencies as well. So we need to know how many households had 0 cars, how many households had 1 car, so on and so forth. So take a moment, make that frequency distribution showing the number of cars and the frequencies. Feel free to pause the video here and then unpause the video when you're ready for the results. Okay, here is that frequency distribution. We have the number of cars ranging from 0 to 4. There were 4 zeros, 6 ones, 5 twos, 3 threes, and 2 fours. Okay, now we're going to take a look at finding the relative frequencies of that distribution and also the cumulative relative frequencies. In order to find the relative frequencies, you are going to take each frequency and divide it by the sum of the frequencies, or the cumulative frequency. So if we add these up, 4 plus 6 is 10, plus 5 is 15, plus 3 is 18, and plus 2 is 20. That corresponds to the prompt because they did say they asked 20 households how many cars they had. So it makes sense that our cumulative frequency is 20. Okay, if we go ahead and find the relative frequency of each group, we're going to take each frequency and divide by that total. We could represent these as fractions, but most often we see these represented as decimals. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video here, find those decimal values, and then unpause the video to get the results. Okay, here are those relative frequencies: 0.2, 0.3, 0.25, 0.15, and 0.1. Now, we could represent these as percentages as well. So if we move that decimal 2 spots to the right, this would be equivalent to 20% of people have 0 cars, 30% of people have 1 car, 25% of people have 2 cars, 15% of people have 3 cars, and 10% of people have 4 cars, according to this survey. Okay, we could find cumulative relative frequency. So in order to find the first one, you are literally just going to pull those numbers straight across. Since there's nothing above it, the cumulative frequency, the cumulative relative frequency for the first group matches the relative frequency for the first group of 0.2. But now when we move down to the next cell, we see that that frequency is 30% or 0.3, but we'd want to include anything that was above it, so less cars than 1. So we would add these 2 frequencies together to get 0.5. Okay, for the next one, we would take this 0.25 and again add any category that it was above it. So 0.25 plus 0.3 plus 0.2. Now you can also find that number because you've already added these 2 together to get 0.5. You can just add on the 0.25 to it. So that would be 0.75. If we add on the next one, the 0.15, be 0.90 or 0.9. And then the last one, if we add 0.1, we get 1.0. This corresponds to 100% of the data is represented by a cumulative relative frequency of this last group. So that means that the percent of people that have 4 or less cars is 100%. So there's nobody that has more than 4 cars in this data set. Okay. This next example is what we call a grouped frequency distribution. So these X values is now they're a range of numbers. That's no longer just a single data value there. So our first class of employees, we have between 1 and 5 employees, and we only have one company that only has that few employees. We have 3 companies that have between 6 and 10 employees. We have 16 companies with 11 to 15 employees, so on and so forth. Okay, so we could still find a relative frequency. For this, we would take each frequency and divide by the total, which they were nice enough to add those together for us to get 25 companies. So I would take 1 divided by 25 here, 3 divided by the 25, 16 divided by 25, 4 divided by 25, and again, 1 divided by 25. Technically, you could represent those as fractions, decimals, or percentages. Most of the time, we do see decimals, though. Okay, I went ahead and added those decimals. So when I divided the 1 divided by 25, I got 0.04. And so we can see the relative frequency for each one of those categories. Now to get the cumulative relative frequency, again, we just pull over the first one. Since there's no companies that have less than 1 employee, there would be no company there, right? So the next one, we're going to take 0.12 rather, and add on the 0.04. So we get a cumulative relative frequency of 0.16. So that means that there's 16% of companies that have 10 or less employees. If I add on the next one, 0.16 plus 6.64 gives me 80% of companies have 15 or less employees. If I add on the next one, 96% of companies have 20 or less employees. And lastly, I get 100% of employees of companies have 25 or less employees. Again, according to this distribution. Okay, this concludes our notes on frequency distributions, both ungrouped and grouped.